What happens when a young woman faces harassment on a crowded city bus, surrounded by passengers who turn away in silence? No one moves, no one speaks, as tears stream down her face. But they didn't notice the man in the back, wearing a black leather jacket, who was about to change everything. This ordinary Monday morning bus ride was about to become a moment that would shake social media and transform lives forever. The number 47 bus rolled through downtown at 7:30 a.m., packed with commuters heading to work. Abigail Alvarez clutched her medical textbooks closer, trying to make herself smaller as a group of men towered over her seat. Their shadows loomed larger with each passing stop, their words cutting deeper than knives. She had endured harassment before, but this time was different. This time, she couldn't escape. The bus driver watched through his mirror, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Other passengers buried their faces in their phones, newspapers, anything to avoid witnessing what was unfolding. But they didn't know that sitting quietly in the back row was someone they'd all recognize, a man who had fought injustice both on screen and off. And when his voice finally broke through the tension, the entire bus would come to a screeching halt. Abigail Alvarez adjusted her white medical coat, carefully folded from last night's ironing session. Her small studio apartment above Tang's grocery wasn't much, but the mirror propped against the wall reflected a determined young woman who had crossed oceans to chase her dreams. At 23, she carried more than just medical textbooks. She carried her immigrant parents' hopes, their sacrifices condensed into the acceptance letter from Central Medical School that she kept pressed between her notebook pages. Every morning, Abigail counted her coins for bus fare, remembering her father's words before she left Shanghai. Education costs money, but ignorance costs more. The number 47 bus had become her daily companion, its familiar diesel rumble marking the start of another day pursuing her medical degree. She knew every stop, every turn, every screech of its brakes. Some days, she'd catch Mike Thompson, the regular driver, humming old rock songs under his breath. He had driven this route for 15 years, his salt and pepper hair marking the seasons of countless commuters' lives. Mike noticed Abigail too, her polite nod each morning, the way she always offered her seat to elderly passengers, how she studied her medical texts even while standing. She reminded him of his own daughter, away at college on the East Coast. This Monday morning, he watched through his rearview mirror as Abigail boarded, her dark hair neatly tied back, medical jacket crisp despite the early hour. But something felt different today. The usual morning crowd had a new addition, a group of men he'd never seen before, their laughter too loud, their presence too imposing. Abigail felt it too as she scanned her bus pass. The artificial cheer of their voices carried an edge that made her grip her books tighter. She chose her usual spot, third row from the back, next to the window where she could watch the city wake up. But today, the familiar view offered no comfort. She didn't notice the man who boarded at the next stop, his black leather jacket blending into the shadows of the early morning. She was too busy trying to make herself invisible as heavy footsteps approached her row. The city scrolled past outside her window, the same coffee shops, the same newsstands, the same street corners. But this ordinary Monday was about to become anything but routine. In the coming hours, this bus ride would spark conversations across social media, challenge a city's conscience, and remind everyone that sometimes the most extraordinary heroes wear ordinary clothes. And it would all begin with a simple act of standing up when others chose to remain seated. The morning light filtered through the bus windows, casting long shadows across the aisle as the number 47 continued its route downtown. Abigail opened her medical textbook, trying to focus on neurology diagrams while the group of men shuffled closer. Their presence filled the space around her seat, cologne and cigarette smoke mixing with the bus's stale air. 4 of them, all wearing matching basketball jerseys, had been eyeing her since they boarded 3 stops ago. Mike Thompson watched from his driver's seat, his eyes darting between the road and his rear-view mirror. 20 years on this route had taught him to sense trouble before it started. These men weren't his regular passengers. Their swagger, their loud voices, the way they positioned themselves around Abigail's seat like wolves circling prey. His fingers tightened on the steering wheel as their voices grew louder. "Hey sweetheart, what you studying there?" The tallest one, a muscular man with a tribal tattoo snaking up his neck, leaned over Abigail's shoulder, his breath hot against her ear. "Must be pretty smart stuff for a pretty girl like you." His friends snickered, elbowing each other as they closed ranks around her seat. Abigail hunched lower, pulling her textbook closer to her chest like a shield. The morning commuters noticed. The woman in business attire across the aisle suddenly became fascinated with her phone. The elderly man 2 rows ahead adjusted his hearing aid, pretending not to listen. A teenager with headphones turned up his music, eyes fixed on the floor. The silence of the other passengers grew heavier with each passing moment, their collective avoidance becoming a tangible weight in the air. "Come on, don't be like that. We just want to know what makes you so special." Another man, wearing a gold chain that caught the morning light, reached for her textbook. Abigail pulled back, her shoulder hitting the window. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she remembered her mother's warnings about staying safe in a foreign country. She had assured them America would be different, that education would protect her. Now, trapped against the window with strange men hovering over her, those promises felt hollow. The bus lurched around a corner, and the men used the motion as an excuse to press closer. "Maybe she thinks she's too good for us," the third man said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "These foreign girls, always acting so superior." His words cut through the mechanical rumble of the bus, sharp and deliberate. Abigail felt tears beginning to form but refused to let them fall. She wouldn't give them that satisfaction. Mike Thompson's jaw clenched as he watched the scene unfold in his mirror. He'd seen harassment before, had even stopped the bus once or twice when things got out of hand. But these men were different. Something in their eyes told him they wouldn't back down easily. His hand hovered over the radio to call dispatch. But what would he say? They hadn't done anything technically wrong yet, just words and intimidating presence. He'd seen too many drivers get reprimanded for overreacting. In the back of the bus, movement stirred in the shadows. The man in the black leather jacket shifted slightly, his attention focused on the scene unfolding before him. His presence had gone unnoticed by the other passengers, just another face in the crowd. But his eyes narrowed as he watched the harassment escalate, his posture changing from relaxed to alert. "Show us what you're reading, princess." The tattooed man's hand shot out, grabbing the corner of Abigail's textbook. She held on tighter, but her fingers were slipping. A small whimper escaped her throat as the book began to pull away from her grasp. The other passengers stared harder at their phones, their newspapers, their shoes, anywhere but at the young woman being tormented in their midst. The tension in the bus had reached a breaking point. Abigail's world had shrunk to this moment, this space, these men who had decided she was their morning's entertainment. The city outside continued its morning routine, unaware of the drama playing out behind the bus's tinted windows. Traffic lights changed, pedestrians crossed streets, life went on as normal while Abigail's nightmare continued to unfold. And then, just as the tattooed man's grip on her textbook tightened, a voice cut through the tension. Calm, commanding, and instantly recognizable to anyone who had ever watched an action movie. The kind of voice that could stop traffic, change lives, and in this case, bring an entire bus to a sudden, dramatic halt. The voice that broke through the tension was steady and firm, carrying an authority that made every head on the bus turn. "I believe the lady would like to be left alone." The man in the black leather jacket stood up, his tall frame unfolding from the shadows of the back row. The morning light caught his features, and a collective gasp rippled through the bus as recognition dawned on the passengers' faces. The tattooed man kept his grip on Abigail's textbook, but his cocky smile faltered slightly. He turned toward the voice, ready to confront whoever dared interrupt their fun. But the words died in his throat as Keanu Reeves stepped into the aisle, his presence commanding attention without raising his voice. The other passengers who had been so determined to ignore the harassment now couldn't look away. Mike Thompson watched through his mirror as the scene unfolded, his foot hovering over the brake pedal. The morning traffic flowed around them, but inside the bus, time seemed to stand still. Abigail remained frozen in her seat, her fingers still clutching her textbook, tears threatening to spill from her eyes. "We're just having a friendly conversation," the man with the gold chain said, trying to salvage their dominance of the situation. But his voice lacked its previous confidence. Keanu took another step forward, his movements measured and deliberate. The fluorescent bus lights cast shadows across his face, reminiscent of his most famous roles. But this wasn't an act. This was real life, and the determination in his eyes was entirely genuine. "Harassment isn't friendly," Keanu replied, his voice carrying to every corner of the bus. "And 4 men intimidating a young woman isn't a conversation." He gestured toward Abigail's textbook. "Let go. Now." The last word carried weight, heavy with the promise of consequences. The tattooed man's friends began to shift uncomfortably, the reality of their situation sinking in. Their target had changed from a seemingly vulnerable young woman to a confrontation with one of Hollywood's most respected actors. More importantly, they faced a man known for standing up against injustice both on and off screen. But the tattooed man wasn't ready to back down. His grip tightened on the textbook, and he squared his shoulders. "Or what? You gonna pull some Matrix moves on us?" He forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow even to his own ears. The other passengers watched in tense silence, phones raised to record what was happening. That's when Mike Thompson made his decision. He slammed on the brakes, the bus screeching to a halt in the middle of the block. The sudden stop sent everyone lurching forward, and in that moment of chaos, the tattooed man's grip on Abigail's textbook finally loosened. She pulled it close to her chest, scrambling away from the men as tears finally spilled down her cheeks. Keanu steadied himself against a seat, then straightened up. "The next stop is right there," he said, pointing through the windshield. "I suggest you four get off and think about how you treat others." His tone left no room for argument. The bus remained stopped, its engine idling as traffic flowed around them. The man with the gold chain tugged at his friend's sleeve. "Come on, man. It's not worth it." The other two were already backing toward the door, their earlier bravado evaporating under the combined stares of Keanu Reeves and the now awakened conscience of the other passengers. The tattooed man looked around, realizing he had lost control of the situation. His friends were retreating, the other passengers were recording everything, and he stood alone against someone whose mere presence had changed the entire dynamic. He took a step back, trying to save face. "Whatever. This bus is lame anyway." Mike Thompson's finger hovered over the door control. "Exit's right here, gentlemen. And don't bother trying to ride my route again." His voice carried the authority of someone who had finally found the courage to speak up. The doors hissed open, and the four men shuffled out, their departure marked by the quiet clicks of phone cameras capturing their faces. As the doors closed behind them, Abigail's soft sobs were the only sound on the bus. Keanu moved carefully, keeping his distance to not frighten her further. "Are you all right?" he asked gently. She nodded, unable to speak, clutching her textbook like a lifeline. An elderly woman finally stood up from her seat, offering Abigail a tissue from her purse. "I'm so sorry, dear. We should have said something sooner." Other passengers began to murmur similar apologies, shame coloring their faces as they realized their own complicity in allowing the harassment to continue. Mike Thompson pulled the bus properly into the next stop, then turned in his seat to address his passengers. "This shouldn't have happened," he announced, his voice firm. "Not on my bus, not anywhere. From now on, we look out for each other. Is that clear?" The passengers nodded, the atmosphere on the bus transforming from one of fearful silence to collective responsibility. Keanu remained standing in the aisle, a quiet guardian ensuring the moment of change wasn't lost. Abigail wiped her eyes, finally finding her voice. "Thank you," she whispered, looking between Keanu and the bus driver. "Thank you for stopping them." The morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the bus in a different light. What had started as a scene of harassment had transformed into a moment of community, of strangers finally seeing each other as people worth protecting. But this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of a change that would ripple far beyond the confines of the number 47 bus. By afternoon, the video had spread across social media platforms like wildfire. Cell phone footage from multiple angles showed the confrontation on the number 47 bus, each view capturing a different perspective of how Keanu Reeves had stood up against harassment. News vans gathered outside the Metropolitan Transit Authority headquarters, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky as reporters competed for the latest updates on what people were calling the bus incident. Abigail sat in the Transit Authority's office, her medical textbook still clutched close as police officers took her statement. The fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over the room as she recounted the morning's events. Detective Lisa Martinez listened carefully, her pen moving across her notepad as Abigail described each moment of fear, each word of intimidation. The detective's eyes softened when Abigail mentioned how she'd been too afraid to tell her parents about previous incidents of harassment. Outside the office, Mike Thompson waited on a hard plastic chair, still in his bus driver uniform. He'd been interviewed twice already, once by his supervisors and once by the police. His hands twisted in his lap as he remembered all the times he'd seen similar situations but hadn't acted quickly enough. The weight of those memories pressed against his conscience, but today's events had awakened something in him. He'd already drafted a proposal for new safety protocols on city buses. The transit authorities' phones rang continuously. Social media comments poured in by the thousands, many sharing similar stories of harassment on public transportation. The four men from the bus had been identified within hours, their faces clearly captured on dozens of phones. The tattooed man, identified as James Morton, had already been fired from his job at a local construction company. His employer's statement condemned his actions and emphasized their zero-tolerance policy for harassment. Keanu had stayed at the transit authority just long enough to give his statement, his presence quiet but impactful. Before leaving, he'd handed Abigail his lawyer's business card, ensuring she had support if she needed it. But more importantly, he'd looked her in the eyes and said something that made her sit up straighter. Your education matters. Your safety matters. Never let anyone make you feel otherwise. By evening, the incident had sparked a city-wide conversation about bystander intervention. News channels interviewed psychology professors about the bystander effect, while social media buzzed with discussions about personal responsibility and public safety. The other passengers from the bus began coming forward, their interviews tinged with regret and determination to do better. The Metropolitan Transit Authority announced emergency meetings to review their harassment policies. Women's advocacy groups seized the moment to push for better security measures on public transportation. Security camera footage from previous weeks revealed that Morton and his friends had harassed other women on different bus routes, building a pattern that prosecutors were now eager to address. Abigail's medical school classmates rallied around her. They organized a buddy system for commuting students, ensuring no one had to travel alone. Dr. Patricia Alvarez, the dean of Central Medical School, issued a statement supporting Abigail and announcing a new scholarship program for students who demonstrated courage in the face of adversity. As night fell over the city, Abigail finally returned to her small apartment above Tang's grocery. Mrs. Tang herself was waiting with a hot bowl of soup and tears in her eyes. She'd seen the video, recognized her young tenant, and felt a mother's worry. You study so hard, work so hard, Mrs. Tang said, pressing the soup into Abigail's hands. Tomorrow, my son will drive you to school. No bus until those men are caught. Abigail's phone buzzed continuously with messages from her parents in Shanghai. They'd seen the news too. The story had crossed oceans. Her mother's voice trembled over video chat as she asked if Abigail wanted to come home. But Abigail straightened her shoulders, remembering Keanu's words. No, Mama, she replied firmly. I'm staying. My education matters. The Transit Authority security team worked through the night, reviewing camera footage from other routes, building a case against Morton and his friends. Detective Martinez's investigation revealed a history of complaints against the men, previously ignored or dismissed. Now, with public attention focused on the issue, those complaints carried new weight. As midnight approached, Mike Thompson sat at his Kit Alvarez table, unable to sleep. He'd spent hours writing a detailed report about everything he'd witnessed in his 15 years of driving buses. Every incident he'd seen, every moment he'd wished he'd acted differently. Tomorrow, he would submit it to his supervisors, along with his proposals for change. The video of today's incident had shown him that one person speaking up could inspire others to find their voice. The city wouldn't sleep easily that night. The incident had forced everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about their own behavior in public spaces. But in that discomfort lay the seeds of change, waiting to grow into something stronger than fear or indifference. 1 week after the bus incident, Abigail returned to her regular commute, but everything had changed. The number 47 bus now had a security officer on board, part of the Transit Authority's new safety initiative. Mike Thompson still drove the route, but his demeanor had transformed. He greeted every passenger personally, his eyes alert and watchful, creating an atmosphere of protection rather than just transportation. Abigail noticed other changes too. Passengers who had once buried themselves in their phones now made eye contact, exchanged smiles, kept watch over one another. When a teenage girl boarded alone one morning, an elderly woman patted the seat next to her, offering silent companionship. The bus had become more than just a vehicle. It had become a community. James Morton, the tattooed man who had led the harassment, faced serious consequences. The video had cost him his job, his reputation, and nearly his freedom. But something unexpected happened during his court-mandated counseling sessions. Forced to confront his behavior, he began to understand the impact of his actions. His counselor connected him with a women's advocacy group, where he heard stories that changed his perspective forever. Morton started attending support groups for men working to change their behavior. In one session, He broke down while describing the look of fear in Abigail's eyes that morning on the bus. "I have a sister," he admitted, his voice cracking. "If someone did that to her..." The realization of his actions hit him like a physical blow. His journey toward redemption would be long, but it had begun with that moment of clarity. Mike Thompson's proposal for new safety protocols gained traction within the transit authority. His years of experience, combined with the publicity from the incident, gave weight to his recommendations. Security cameras were upgraded, emergency buttons installed, and driver training expanded to include intervention strategies. Other cities began requesting copies of his proposal, recognizing the need for similar changes in their own transit systems. The other passengers from that morning struggled with their own guilt and transformation. The businesswoman who had stared at her phone created a non-profit organization focusing on bystander intervention training. The teenage boy with headphones started a social media campaign called "Look Up, Speak Up," encouraging young people to be more aware of their surroundings and ready to help others. Abigail's medical school performance improved once she no longer had to worry about her daily commute. Her professors noticed a new confidence in her presentations, a stronger voice when she spoke in class. The incident had shown her that she wasn't alone, that her presence in the medical field mattered. She began mentoring other international students, helping them navigate not just their studies but the challenges of life in a new country. Keanu's intervention had sparked more than just viral videos and news coverage. It had created a ripple effect of kindness and awareness throughout the city. People began sharing stories of times they'd witnessed harassment and done nothing, vowing to do better. Security companies reported increased requests for self-defense classes, not just from potential victims but from people wanting to know how to safely help others. The transit authority's statistics told their own story. Reports of harassment dropped significantly as more passengers began speaking up. Drivers felt empowered to stop their vehicles and intervene when needed, knowing they had institutional support. The number 47 route, once known for its problems, became a model for other lines to follow. James Morton's transformation proved genuine. After completing his counseling, he approached the transit authority through his lawyer, offering to share his story as part of their new driver training program. His perspective as someone who had changed provided valuable insights into preventing similar incidents. Though he never expected forgiveness, his efforts to make amends were sincere. Abigail kept Keanu's lawyer's business card pinned to her bulletin board, not because she needed legal help anymore, but as a reminder that sometimes help comes from unexpected places. The card became a symbol of hope for her, proof that standing up for what's right could create lasting change. As autumn turned to winter, the number 47 bus continued its daily route through the city. But now, when Abigail boarded each morning, she found herself surrounded by allies instead of strangers. The incident that had started with fear had transformed into a catalyst for change, touching lives far beyond that single morning commute. 1 month after the incident, Abigail stood at her usual bus stop, watching the sunrise paint the city in shades of gold. The number 47 bus approached right on schedule, Mike Thompson at the wheel. As the doors opened, he greeted her with a warm smile that had become their morning ritual. The bus interior looked different now. New security cameras gleamed discreetly in the corners, emergency buttons glowed softly near every seat, and a sign prominently displayed the Transit Authority's zero-tolerance policy for harassment. Today was special. The Metropolitan Transit Authority had invited Abigail to speak at their annual safety conference. Her medical textbook stayed home, replaced by a carefully prepared speech about her experience. As she settled into her usual seat, she noticed how the other regular passengers nodded in recognition. A young woman wearing nurse's scrubs sat next to her, part of the informal network of healthcare workers who had started commuting together after hearing Abigail's story. The conference center buzzed with activity when the bus arrived. Television crews set up their equipment while transit officials from across the country gathered in the auditorium. Abigail spotted Keanu Reeves in the lobby, dressed simply in black, talking quietly with Mike Thompson. He had flown in specifically for this event, understanding how his presence would amplify its importance. James Morton was there too, standing nervously at the back of the room. His presence had been controversial, but Abigail herself had supported his request to attend. He looked different now, humbled, the aggressive confidence replaced by genuine remorse. The tribal tattoo on his neck was now partially covered by a new design. Simple words reading, "Choose kindness." The conference opened with Mike Thompson presenting the dramatic changes in transit safety statistics. Harassment reports had dropped by 60% across all routes. More importantly, intervention rates had skyrocketed, Passengers and drivers now worked together to prevent incidents before they escalated. His voice swelled with pride as he described how other cities were adopting similar programs. When Abigail took the podium, the room fell silent. She spoke not just about that morning's terror, but about all the mornings that had followed. She described how a moment of cruelty had transformed into a movement of compassion. Her voice grew stronger as she talked about the changes she'd witnessed, how strangers had become guardians, how fear had given way to community. "1 month ago, I was afraid to take the bus," she said, her voice clear and confident. "Today, I board knowing I'm surrounded by people who care. That's not just because of new cameras or security protocols. It's because we finally understood that safety isn't about technology. It's about people choosing to look out for each other." Keanu's speech was brief but powerful. He deflected praise for his intervention, instead focusing on the courage of ordinary people who had transformed a negative incident into positive change. He spoke about how true heroism often meant simply choosing not to remain silent in the face of wrong. The surprise came when James Morton was invited to speak. He walked to the podium slowly, his hands shaking slightly as he adjusted the microphone. "I was the villain in this story," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "I thought I was just having fun, showing off for my friends. I never stopped to think about the fear I was causing, the damage I was doing." He described his journey through counseling, the painful recognition of his behavior's impact, and his ongoing work with anti-harassment programs. "I can't undo what I did," he said, looking directly at Abigail. "But I can spend the rest of my life trying to prevent others from making the same mistakes." After the conference, Abigail found herself in an unexpected conversation with James. They sat in the conference center's lobby, under the watchful eyes of security personnel and concerned onlookers. James apologized again, not seeking forgiveness but needing her to know how deeply he regretted his actions. "I have a daughter now," he said quietly, pulling out his phone to show a picture of a newborn baby girl. "When I think about someone treating her the way I treated you..." He couldn't finish the sentence. Abigail looked at the photo, understanding that sometimes change comes from seeing yourself in others. Keanu joined them briefly, his presence adding weight to the moment. He spoke about the power of transformation, how single moments could redirect entire lives. Before leaving, he handed Abigail an envelope. Inside was a grant for her medical school, ensuring she could complete her studies without financial worry. The day ended where it had begun, on the number 47 bus. Mike Thompson made one last run, carrying conference attendees back to their hotels. Abigail sat in her usual seat, but this time Keanu sat beside her. They talked about ordinary things, her medical studies, his latest film projects, their shared belief in the importance of standing up for others. As the bus wound through the evening traffic, Abigail noticed something remarkable. Passengers who had attended the conference were chatting with regular commuters, sharing stories and contact information. The bus had become more than a symbol of change. It was now a place where change actively happened. A young girl, perhaps 12 years old, approached their seat clutching a notebook. She looked nervously between Abigail and Keanu before gathering her courage to speak. "I saw the video," she said. "It made me want to be brave too." Abigail smiled, understanding that their story had created ripples they might never fully see. The next morning, Abigail boarded the number 47 bus again, resuming her journey toward becoming a doctor. Mike Thompson greeted her with his usual smile, but now there was something more, a shared understanding that they were part of something larger than themselves. As the bus pulled away from the curb, Abigail opened her medical textbook, surrounded by the community that had grown from a moment of courage. The city outside continued its busy pace, but inside the bus, something had fundamentally changed. Where there had once been silence, there was now conversation. Where there had been fear, there was now protection. And in place of indifference, there was now a commitment to ensuring that no one would ever have to face harassment alone again. The viral video of the bus incident reached over 50 million views across social media platforms, but its real impact couldn't be measured in clicks or shares. In break rooms and boardrooms, on college campuses and in community centers, people began having difficult conversations about responsibility and courage. The simple act of one person standing up had created a blueprint for others to follow. Abigail graduated from medical school 2 years later, her ceremony attended by some unexpected guests. Mike Thompson sat proudly in the audience, having become something of a surrogate father figure during her remaining years of study. James Morton attended too, now working full-time with anti-harassment organizations, his story of transformation inspiring others to change. And there, quietly supporting from the back row, was Keanu Reeves, who had maintained a friendship with Abigail through her educational journey. The number 47 bus route became known throughout the city as the Guardian Line, though not because of any official designation. Passengers simply noticed how people looked out for each other there, how strangers became protectors, how a community could form even in the brief space of a morning commute. Other routes began adopting the same informal title as the culture of protection spread throughout the transit system. Abigail's medical practice eventually opened just 2 blocks from her old bus stop. She specialized in helping trauma survivors, understanding firsthand how a moment of vulnerability could change a life. Her waiting room walls displayed framed news articles about the bus incident, not to celebrate her role, but to remind patients that healing was possible, that change could come from the darkest moments. James Morton's daughter grew up knowing her father's story, not as a source of shame but as proof that people could learn, grow, and become better. He taught her about respect and courage, lessons learned from his own failures and transformation. The tribal tattoo on his neck remained partially visible under its new design, a permanent reminder of who he had been and who he had chosen to become. Mike Thompson retired from driving but stayed active in transit safety programs, training new drivers to create the same sense of community he had fostered on his route. His protocols became standard practice across the country, his experience helping shape a new generation of public transportation safety. And Keanu? He continued his quiet acts of kindness across the city and beyond, though he never sought recognition for them. The bus incident was just one of many moments where he chose to stand up, to speak out, to help others find their voice. One small moment of courage had sparked a movement, proving that change doesn't always require grand gestures or elaborate plans. Sometimes it just takes one person willing to stand up, one voice willing to speak out, one heart brave enough to say enough. In the end, the true power of the bus incident wasn't in the viral video or the policy changes. It was in showing that within each of us lies the potential to transform a moment of fear into a legacy of hope.